The entire Coalition Combat Academy believed wielding two weapons at once was biologically impossible, until one quiet human cadet walked into class carrying two swords. 12 minutes later, 4,000 years of military doctrine collapsed in front of hundreds of witnesses, and the galaxy demanded to know what was wrong with the human brain. Instructor Velcrochan had trained cadets for 112 years, and in all that time he had never once needed to raise his voice, because the universe, in its infinite and occasionally merciful wisdom, had given every sentient species exactly one working set of hands for exactly one weapon at a time. This was not opinion, this was not tradition. This was, as far as anyone in the Coalition was concerned, physics, biology, and common sense, all holding hands and nodding in agreement. He wanted that understood clearly, right from the start, because what happened next was going to sound made up, and he needed everyone listening to know that he, Velcrochan, decorated instructor of the Coalition Combat Academy, veteran of the Thren border conflicts, holder of 3 medals he never wore because they clashed with his ceremonial sash, was just as blindsided as anyone. The Academy sat on a moon called Ostrovik, a gray, unglamorous rock chosen specifically because nothing on it could catch fire, explode, or be offended by the noise of several thousand cadets screaming at each other in 40 different languages. Species from across the Coalition sent their brightest young fighters here to learn the same doctrine, drilled into recruits since before Vel's grandmother had scales. The doctrine was simple. One mind, one weapon. You could hold a shield in your offhand, sure. Decoration was allowed. But 2 blades, 2 guns, 2 anything that required independent tactical decision-making was neurologically impossible. The brain, any brain, from the 4-lobed Osrin like himself to the strange, squishy, single-lobed thing humans carried around in their skulls, simply could not split its combat attention in half without both halves performing badly. Every species had tried it at some point in their evolutionary adolescence, and every species had eventually grown up and stopped. Every species except, apparently, the humans, who Vel was beginning to suspect had never actually grown up at all. They had simply gotten louder. He remembered the exact day it started, because it was the same day Cadet Iris Bannerman walked into his classroom carrying 2 short swords strapped to her back instead of the standard single training blade issued to every other recruit. She was unremarkable to look at, by which he meant she looked like most humans looked, which was to say alarmingly soft, mostly hairless except in the places where they insisted on growing it anyway, and built like something that should not, by any reasonable evolutionary logic, have survived contact with a large predator, let alone gone on to conquer several. She was quiet. She did not announce herself. She simply sat in the 3rd row, said nothing, and waited for class to start, which somehow made her more unsettling than if she had marched in shouting. Vel noticed the 2 swords immediately, of course, and made a mental note to correct the clerical error before the safety officers noticed and started asking uncomfortable questions about equipment allocation. Cadet Toma Drexel noticed first, and Toma Drexel, being a Verasi warrior of considerable size and considerably less patience, did not believe in mental notes. He believed in saying things out loud, usually at volume, usually while flexing something. "Is the little human lost?" Toma said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "or does she think this is a costume party?" A few cadets laughed. Iris did not look up from whatever she was doing with the strap on her 2nd sword, which Vel would later learn was called adjusting, a very human habit of fussing with equipment for no productive reason whatsoever. "I heard humans like collecting things," Toma continued, clearly encouraged by the laughter. "Trophies, mostly. Maybe she collects swords she does not know how to use." "2," Iris said without looking up. "For the price of 1. Excellent value. You should try economics sometime, big guy." The laughter shifted direction, which Toma did not appreciate, and Vel decided this was an excellent moment to begin class before someone's pride ended up on the infirmary schedule. He walked to the front of the room, cleared the vocal apparatus in his throat, and began the lecture he had given, in some form or another, more times than he cared to count. "Cadets," he said, "today we discuss the doctrine of singular focus, which some of you clearly still need reminding of." He did not look at anyone in particular, though he absolutely looked at Iris. Every combat-capable species discovers, at some point in its development, the appealing but fatally flawed idea of wielding two weapons simultaneously. It seems efficient. Double the blades, double the damage, yes? Wonderful in theory. He tapped the side of his own head, all 4 temples, one after another, for emphasis. In practice, the brain allocates attention like a resource, because it is one. There is no surplus. When you split combat focus between 2 independent weapons, you do not double your output, you have your competence in both. This has been demonstrated, documented, and repeated across every known sentient species in the Coalition, without exception, for over 4,000 years. It is not a limitation of skill, it is not a limitation of training, it is a limitation of the architecture you were born with, and no amount of enthusiasm changes architecture. He paused there, the way he always paused there, to let the weight of it settle over the room, because young cadets needed to hear that the universe had rules, and that arguing with rules was how you ended up dead in front of an audience. Iris raised her hand. Vel sighed internally, because raised hands from cadets during the closing statement of a settled lecture were never good news for anyone's schedule. Yes, Cadet Bannerman. Define architecture, she said. I beg your pardon. You said it's a limitation of the architecture. I want to know what you mean by that, specifically. Neural pathway count? Processing bandwidth? Attention allocation as a literal finite resource, or as a trained habit that everyone just assumes is finite because nobody's ever tried breaking it? The room went quiet in a way Vel did not care for. It was the kind of quiet that happened right before something expensive got broken. It is settled science, Cadet. Settled by who? By every species that has ever tried and failed. Have humans tried? Vel opened his mouth, then closed it, because he genuinely did not know the answer, and admitting that in front of 40 cadets was not something his pride was prepared to survive on a normal Tuesday. The Coalition archives contain no record of successful dual-wield combat by any registered species, he said instead. Which was true, and also, he would later realize, an extremely lawyerly way of not actually answering the question. Iris nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they have decided not to argue further, which in Vel's experience was infinitely more concerning than someone who kept arguing, because it meant they had simply moved the argument somewhere he could no longer see it. Understood, she said. Thank you, Instructor. She went back to adjusting her sword strap. Vel went back to his lecture. Toma Drexel went back to looking smug, entirely unaware that smugness, much like architecture, was about to be revealed as far less permanent than he assumed. After class, Vel found himself walking past the sparring yards, where Iris's friend, a lanky, perpetually amused human named Rook Halverson, was leaning against a fence post, watching her run drills. She does this every morning, Rook said, apparently to Vel, though Vel had not asked, had not slowed down, and had made no indication whatsoever that he wanted a conversation. Humans, he had noticed, treated silence as an invitation rather than a boundary. Does what? Vel said, against his better judgment. The two-sword thing. Started when she was a kid. Her mom put her in fencing lessons, her dad put her in drumming lessons, same year. And instead of picking one, she just did both at the same time, every single day, for like a decade. Fencing lesson, straight to drum lesson, straight home to do homework while listening to music she wasn't supposed to be listening to. Girl's brain has been multitasking since before she had all her adult teeth. That is not combat training, Vel said. That is poor scheduling. Rook grinned, an expression Vel had learned to associate with humans who were about to say something they found extremely funny and everyone else would find extremely alarming. Yeah, well, poor scheduling built different apparently. Vel did not dignify that with a response, mostly because he did not fully understand it, and walked away with the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of a man who has just been told a joke he will not understand the punchline of until it is much, much too late. The evaluation spar was scheduled for the following week, a standard exercise where paired cadets demonstrated technique in front of the full class and, on this particular occasion, in front of Commandant Selavak, who visited these evaluations rarely enough that her presence alone told everyone the stakes had quietly gone up. Toma Drexel requested Iris as his opponent. He requested it loudly, in front of witnesses, in a tone that suggested he considered this less a spar and more a public service announcement about the natural order of things. Vel should have said no. In retrospect, he would say this to himself many times over the following weeks. He should have simply said no, paired them with someone else, and let the lesson about humility arrive some other, less catastrophic way. But Toma was a strong cadet, technically excellent, and Vel, if he was being honest with himself, wanted to see the human's confidence handled properly by someone who actually knew what they were doing. He got his wish. He simply did not get the outcome he expected. The sparring yard was packed. Cadets pressed against the rails, murmuring in a dozen languages, all of which translated roughly to some variation of "this should be quick." Toma entered first, spinning his single training blade in a showy little flourish that drew a scattering of laughter and appreciative growls from the Verasi contingent. Iris entered a moment later, two blunted practice swords, one in each hand, held low, almost casually, like someone carrying groceries rather than weapons. Commandant Selavok, seated in the raised observation box, said nothing, but Vel noticed her spinal ridge stiffen slightly at the sight of the two blades. A small thing. He filed it away without thinking much of it, which was, again, in retrospect, a mistake he made rather a lot during this particular period of his career. The referee called the start. Toma moved first, of course, because Toma always moved first, closing distance with the kind of aggressive textbook footwork the Academy had drilled into 3 generations of cadets. Iris did not retreat. She did not advance either. Not exactly. She shifted, sideways, at an angle Vel's mind initially processed as clumsy, an amateur's misstep, the kind of mistake that got you killed in a real engagement. Toma's blade swept toward her center mass. Her left sword rose to intercept it, almost lazily, while her right hand was already moving somewhere else entirely. Somewhere Toma's training had not prepared him to look, because no training anywhere in the coalition prepared you to watch two things happening in the same half-second from the same opponent. The tip of her second blade touched his ribs, lightly. A scoring touch rather than a killing one, and the room went very, very quiet. Toma reset, visibly annoyed, and came again, faster this time. A combination strike meant to overwhelm. 3 strikes in rapid succession, each one designed to chain into the next. A sequence that had ended most sparring matches Vel had ever watched within the first 10 seconds. Iris's left sword parried the first strike. Her right sword parried the second, an entirely independent motion, executed with an entirely independent rhythm, as if 2 separate fighters were somehow occupying the same small body and had simply agreed, ahead of time, to split the workload evenly. The third strike, Toma's finisher, met empty air because Iris had simply stepped through the gap his own combination had left open, and both blunted swords came to rest, one at his throat, one at the back of his knee, in the same instant. Nobody in that yard, Vel included, had ever seen anything like it. It did not look practiced, exactly, though it obviously was. It looked instinctive, which was somehow worse, because instinct implied this was simply how her mind worked, not a technique she had learned but a native language she had always spoken and everyone else in the coalition was only now hearing for the first time. The referee, a very confused Thren officer, called the match roughly 4 seconds after it should have been called, because he, like everyone else present, had simply forgotten his job existed. Toma stood frozen, both swords resting against him, his face doing something complicated that Vel suspected did not have a comfortable translation in any language. That was when Commandant Selavok stood up. "Halt the exercise," she said. And though her voice was calm, it carried the particular flatness of someone who was extremely displeased and working very hard not to show it in front of 200 cadets. She descended from the observation box herself, an act Vel had witnessed exactly twice before in his career, both times preceding disciplinary hearings that had ended careers. She approached Iris directly, ignoring the still frozen Toma entirely. "Cadet Bannerman, report to the medical wing immediately for a full neural scan." "Ma'am, you will comply, or you will be dismissed from this academy pending investigation." Iris, to her credit, did not argue. She lowered both swords, handed them to a nearby cadet who took them like they might be radioactive, and followed the commandant out of the yard without another word, while the entire student body watched in a silence so total Vel could hear the wind moving across the training yard's gravel. The scan, conducted with the kind of clinical thoroughness reserved for suspected cheating, revealed exactly nothing. No illegal neural augments, no banned cognitive enhancers, no hidden implants, no unauthorized modifications, no trace of anything that would explain what 40 cadets and one deeply unsettled instructor had just watched with their own eyes. Just a completely standard human brain doing something no standard brain, human or otherwise, was supposed to be able to do. Vel was called in to review the results personally, given his position as her instructor, and he stood in the medical bay staring at the scan readout with the particular blankness of a man whose entire professional framework had just quietly excused itself from the room. "There is nothing here," said the medical officer, a small, precise Thren woman named Ket Sorov tapping the display. Both hemispheres show simultaneous high activity during the recorded combat sequence, independent parallel processing, sustained for the full duration of the match. No augmentation. No anomaly markers, just, "This is what her baseline apparently looks like under stress." "That is not possible," Vel said, aware even as he said it how thoroughly that sentence had stopped meaning anything useful over the past several days. "I agree," Ket said, and yet, Vel requested a private meeting with Iris that evening, less because protocol demanded it, and more because his own curiosity had become an itch he could no longer politely ignore. She met him in an empty classroom, sitting on top of a desk rather than in a chair, which he had learned by now was simply how she existed in most rooms. "You are not in trouble," he said, mostly to see if it would relax her. It did not appear to, because she had not, as far as he could tell, been worried in the first place. "Good to know," she said. "I want to understand how you do it. I told you already. Fencing lessons, drumming lessons, same year. Nobody told me I had to pick one." "That is an anecdote. It is not an explanation." Iris shrugged, a gesture Vel had come to associate with humans deflecting a question they either did not know the answer to or did not care enough to fully explain. "Honestly, I don't know how to explain it any better than that. Drumming teaches your hands to do two completely different independent things at the same time, on purpose, every single day for years, until it stops feeling like two things and starts feeling like one thing with two halves. Fencing teaches you to read an opponent's intention half a second before their body commits to it. I did both at the same time for basically my entire childhood, and somewhere in there my brain just decided that was normal. Nobody designed this. Nobody told me it was impossible, so I never checked. Every species has children who learn multiple skills. Sure, but how many of your species specifically train two independent limbs to perform two independent high-speed decision-based tasks simultaneously every day, starting before the brain is even fully developed, not sequentially, simultaneously? Because I'm guessing the answer is basically none, since you all seem to agree it's impossible before anybody's even tried. Vel wanted, quite badly, to have a rebuttal for this. He did not have one, which irritated him considerably. "It is one data point," he said instead, grasping for whatever professional footing remained available to him. "One anomalous individual does not overturn 4,000 years of coalition doctrine." Iris smiled, the particular human smile that Vel had begun to recognize as the one that preceded something he was not going to enjoy. "Sure," she said. "Wait till the rest of the academy hears about this." He should have taken that as the warning it was. Word travels through a combat academy faster than through almost any environment Vel had encountered in over a century of service, which was saying something, given that he had once served on a ship where gossip had reportedly outpaced an actual hull breach. Within 3 days, every cadet on Ostrovik knew about the human who had beaten Toma Drexel with 2 swords and passed a full neural scan clean. Within a week, cadets from every species represented at the academy had lined up, one after another, to test the theory themselves, each one absolutely certain that their particular physiology would be the one to finally expose the trick. Vel, against every instinct he possessed, agreed to supervise the informal challenges, partly out of professional obligation, and partly, if he was being scrupulously honest, because he could not physically make himself look away. A Thren cadet named Os Paval went first, relying on his species' famed reaction speed, a physiological advantage that had made Thren duelists feared across a dozen systems. He lasted 11 seconds longer than Toma had, which the Thren contingent considered a moral victory, though Vel noted that 11 seconds longer than nothing was still, mathematically, nothing. A pair of Gren twins, who fought as a bonded combat unit and had never in Academy history lost a 2-on-1 evaluation, challenged her together, apparently reasoning that if one mind could not counter two blades, two minds certainly could. Iris adjusted her footwork, treated the pair as a single expanding and contracting shape rather than two separate opponents, and disarmed both of them within the same 6-second window, a detail Vel found himself repeating to Commandant Vok later, with a species of enthusiasm he did not entirely recognize in himself. An Osran cadet, one of Vel's own species, 4 arms and 4 weapons, the theoretical maximum of what any known biology could wield, lost so thoroughly and so quickly that the review footage became, within days, a piece of unofficial Academy folklore, replayed in barracks across the moon, with the reverent horror usually reserved for natural disasters. By the second week, Vel had stopped pretending, even to himself, that this was an anomaly to be dismissed. He had started, quietly, keeping his own notes. Toma Drexel did not take his loss well, which Vel supposed was understandable, given that Toma had spent his entire Academy career being told, correctly, that he was one of the most physically gifted cadets in his cohort. Losing to Iris once might have been an embarrassment he could absorb. Losing to her in front of the entire Academy, in a match that had since been watched and rewatched by every cadet with access to the training archive, was a wound of an entirely different order. He requested a rematch. He requested it privately this time, through official channels, without the theatrics of his first challenge, which Vel noted with some private satisfaction as evidence that at least a small portion of the lesson had already landed. Toma trained obsessively in the weeks leading up to the rematch. Vel observed some of these sessions personally, and found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, offering genuine tactical advice rather than his usual detached commentary, because whatever else was true, Toma's dedication had become impossible not to respect. The rematch was scheduled for the final evaluation of the term, and this time the entire Academy attended, along with, Vel noted with some alarm, 3 visiting coalition officials who had apparently heard enough rumors from Ostrovik to justify an off-schedule inspection. Toma entered the yard differently this time. Slower, more controlled. He had clearly spent the intervening weeks studying every available second of footage of Iris's previous matches, looking for patterns, for tells, for anything resembling a weakness in what still, to most observers, looked like an impossible technique. The match that followed lasted nearly 4 minutes, an eternity by Academy sparring standards, and was, by unanimous agreement among everyone present, the finest display of single-blade technique anyone had seen from a cadet in a decade. Toma had adapted. He no longer attacked in the rigid telegraphed combinations that had failed him before. He moved unpredictably, feinted with his whole body rather than just his blade, forced Iris to commit early and recover late, over and over, testing every seam in her rhythm he could find. He found several. He simply could not find enough of them fast enough. The end came not with a dramatic flourish, but with something quieter, almost gentle, one blade catching his weapon and turning it aside, the other coming to rest against his shoulder before he had even finished his own attempted recovery. He had lost, again, but this time everyone in that yard, Vel included, understood they had watched 2 genuinely excellent fighters, not a joke, and a punchline. Iris lowered her swords and extended a hand which Toma, after a long moment, took. "You almost had me on the 3rd exchange," she said. "The feint into the low guard. Nobody's tried that on me before." "It did not work," Toma said, with the flat dignity of someone determined not to sulk in public. "No, but it will, eventually, against someone. You should keep it." Vel watched Toma's face do something complicated again, though this time it resolved, slowly, into something that looked almost like respect, which was, in its own way, a more remarkable development than the fight itself. The coalition officials, predictably, were less gracious about the whole affair. Vel was summoned, along with Commandant Vok, to a closed session 2 days later, where the assembled officials spent the better part of an hour discussing, with the particular anxious precision of people who had built entire careers on a doctrine now visibly on fire, what exactly this meant for 4,000 years of combat theory. "It is one individual," said one official, a Gren administrator whose title Vel had already forgotten, in a tone that suggested he was trying very hard to convince himself of the fact. "It is one individual we know of," Commandant Vok replied, and Vel noticed with some private amusement that she did not sound nearly as troubled by this as the officials clearly wanted her to be. "There is no reason to assume she is unique among her species. There is only reason to assume she is the first one anyone bothered to test. The doctrine of singular focus has been foundational to coalition combat training for 4 millennia. Then it is overdue for a footnote," Vok said, and Vel, who had known her for 11 years and could count on one hand the number of times she had said anything approaching a joke, decided that this was in fact a joke, and allowed himself the smallest possible smile. The meeting ended without resolution, as these meetings generally did, though Vel gathered from the tone of the closing remarks that somewhere in the coalition's sprawling bureaucracy, several very tired committees were about to spend the next few years arguing about how to quietly revise several thousand pages of settled doctrine without admitting, in so many words, that it had never actually been settled at all. Vel returned to his classroom that evening later than usual, the training yard empty, the lights dimmed to their overnight setting, and found, to his mild surprise, that he was not entirely ready to go home. He walked to the equipment rack instead, where 2 blunted practice swords sat, mismatched, clearly the same ones Iris had used weeks earlier and never quite returned to the correct storage bin, a detail that would have irritated him considerably before all of this started, and now simply made him feel unaccountably fond of the chaos she had introduced into his otherwise very orderly professional life. He picked one up in each of his upper hands, out of what he told himself was pure curiosity and nothing resembling an actual attempt, and immediately discovered that his left arm had absolutely no idea what his right arm was doing, and neither arm particularly appreciated being asked to find out. He stood there for a long moment. In the empty yard, 2 swords held at 2 entirely uncoordinated angles, feeling, for the first time in over a century of teaching settled science to eager young cadets, genuinely and thoroughly foolish. "Too old for this," he muttered to nobody, to the empty yard, to the 4,000 years of doctrine currently deflating somewhere behind him like a punctured tent. He did not put the swords down immediately, though. He stood there a while longer, testing, adjusting, failing, in the particular quiet way of someone who had just watched the rules of the universe get quietly and thoroughly rewritten by a very unassuming young woman with 2 short swords and absolutely no idea she was supposed to find that impossible. It occurred to him, as he finally set the swords back on the rack and turned to leave, that this was probably going to keep happening, not just with swords, not just with Iris Bannerman. Somewhere out there, across 1,000 worlds newly open to coalition membership, there were, in all likelihood, other humans doing other things that everyone else had confidently declared impossible, simply because nobody had told them not to try. He found, walking back through the darkened corridors of an academy that had for 4,000 years prided itself on knowing exactly what was and was not possible, that the thought did not bother him nearly as much as it probably should have. It was, he decided, going to be an extremely interesting century.